Hi, my name is Chris Conetzkey. I'm the publisher and executive editor for The Business Record. We're here today to host a roundtable for our annual real estate magazine. This is one of 5 videos that we're doing, and today we're going to be focusing on the land segment of real estate and development. The magazine is going to publish on April 24th, and in each video we're going to be exploring a different segment of real estate and development. With us today, we've got a great panel, and also Kathy Bolten, our senior staff writer who works on writing Commercial Real Estate Weekly and reports about real estate and development in our community. I'm going to turn it over to her now. She's going to ask the first question. Each of our panelists is going to respond, and from there, although I'm adjusting the camera now, you're going to be just a little bit of a fly on the wall. We're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves. You'll see Kathy taking notes and getting ready for her reporting, because she'll be using the content from today's video and things that you might see in some of our products. So Kathy, why don't you take it away and get us going with the first question.
Well, thanks for joining us today. The first question is, if you could just sort of talk about what the most important factor you see affecting land development in 2020 being. And as you answer this question, if you'd introduce yourselves before you answer. Start, Chris.
I get to start, all
Yeah.
right. Chris Della, Vedova. I'm president of Confluence Landscape Architects and Planners in Des Moines and across the upper Midwest. Most important thing that we're seeing, I think, right now with 2020 coming up is if we can get some of the uncertainty out of the marketplace. We've got a lot of stuff queued up. We probably have more projects on the books than we've ever had at this point in the year, which is a good thing. Now, if they all move forward, will be another test. But I think it's that uncertainty out there right now is one of the big factors that will impact 2020.
Good morning. I'm Jackie Nickolaus. I'm a VP of Development Services with Benchmark Real Estate Group. And I see one of the major issues heading into 2020 is still cost of construction, both from a labor side and from a material side. It plugs into that uncertainty that Chris was talking about. But labor shortages are increasing the cost of labor, and then with tariffs and just material cost increases, it's hard to keep pace and know exactly how much a project is going to cost.
I'm Clyde Evans. I'm the Director of Community and Economic Development for the City of West Des Moines. I guess I kind of go along the same lines as Chris. I think the investor confidence. And we've been on a roll for the last few years. We were coming off our second best year ever in terms of construction activity. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty out there of whether or not the market's going to continue to sustain itself through 2020 and maybe even into 2021.
Kathy, I just want to follow up real quick. The uncertainty that you're talking about, can you talk about what some of those factors are that are maybe leading to that uncertainty?
I would say, Jackie touched on it, labor cost. Where are interest rates going to go? There's been a lot of push to lower interest rates, even negative interest rates. But labor cost, material cost, we've seen projects where within 1 month the cost of steel has gone up 38%. And that is hard to build into the equation when you're looking at doing a project.
And to add on to that, I think, and Jackie touched on it also, the labor market is, can projects get built in a timeline that makes it economically viable still? That's, we're seeing prices coming back at least 30% higher than what we thought they would be 6 weeks earlier. So
Is that 30% higher because of the labor market?
it's a combination of everything. Everyone's scrambling to find labor, to get materials. Steel's been a huge driver in costs. So one of the things I'm seeing a lot of, and I'd be interested to hear these guys' take, is the idea of modular construction, and is that going to get into this market like it has in some of the others, and will that help some of the costs?
Before we do that, what's modular construction?
Depends on who you talk to, but like one article I just read talked about a hotel in St. Louis that all their bathrooms were built someplace else in a factory brought on site, set, and integrated. And they were able to, meet their schedule with that because they didn't have any lost days due to weather or anything else.
I think they did something with the Hilton,
Yeah, it was.
right?
Okay.
Yes, they use
downtown
modular
Hilton.
bathrooms there.
So yeah, just how much can happen not on site.
You're also seeing, as close as Kansas City, modular apartments and hotel rooms where they construct the entire room off-site or the entire apartment off-site, and they connect them together, and then they only have to do the common area and on-site. And typically in that situation, there's 2 general contractors, which makes it complicated. But one of the things I started researching it because of the projects we're doing is that a lot of those manufacturing facilities don't have the capacity either because of the labor shortage. Because, for example, one of the plants was in Nebraska, and they were running triple shifts to get this hotel done in Kansas City, and that's not sustainable. So that's part of the problem. If you don't have enough labor, it doesn't matter where, if you're building it outside or inside in a modular factory.
Clyde, are you seeing projects come in with modular construction components?
We actually have had some residential projects in the past that use some forms of modular construction where they were actually building wall assemblies off-site and then bringing them to the property. Not so much of late, though.
I would imagine there might be pros and cons to modular development, so I'm just curious if you know anything about what maybe the drawbacks would be or positives.
You reverse a lot of the timelines in doing a project. So when you do a hotel or apartments, you're often choosing the finishes towards the end of the project. At the beginning of the project, you're doing more simple things like exterior selections, et cetera. In a modular, you're picking out those aspects first, and you need to have them set, and they don't change. So you reverse your inputs into the process. So it's just, it takes a while to get in the rhythm of doing a project like that then. And then you have to be very well organized on site, because that's hauling the units to the site and assembling them on the site is a huge cost. And you need to make sure you're organized, you have your trucks, you have the roads, because you don't have any room to, for air on that because it's so expensive.
We talked a little bit about how good things have been. Everybody's busy. You have lots of projects coming in. How long is that going to last?
I laugh because the running joke at Crew Iowa, Ashley Oust went to a seminar. Hubble had economists come in, and they said April of 2020. So we've been laughing when everybody says, well, when's this going to end? We're like, April 2020. But yeah, this upturn has lasted longer than anybody's forecast, and so it's going to slow down sometime. Nobody knows when. Just when you think there's signs of it, then something happens and it bounces back. So if we only had our crystal balls.
Yeah, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I could tell you when that was going to happen. Right now, all the indications for us are just on backlog of work. Now, all of that can always go on hold or through the end of 2020, maybe into early 2021. And again, that's part of that uncertainty that we talked about at the beginning. Nobody really knows. And I think one of the things is, what is the level of slowdown when it happens? We all, we've been discussing when the slowdown is going to happen for multiple years now. But I think the bigger thing there is going to be, is it a slight correction, or do we have a major backslide? So,
I think also something that will affect, when we may start seeing a slowdown is if we start seeing a slowdown of the population growth of the metro. As long as we still have a lot of people moving here that are needing housing, they need services, so there's still the market out there that is needing to be filled. We don't really have an oversupply of much of anything.
One thing I wonder is, we've been talking about the long recovery and the long cycle of growth. and we keep almost every year you're talking about, well, when will it slow down? I always kind of wonder whether that feedback mechanism itself is what is preventing the slowdown from happening. In other words, I remember Jim Paulson from Wells Capital Management said, when things go super gangbusters, that's when people get their animal spirits out, and that's actually what causes the next recession. So it just makes me wonder whether there's actually maybe more potential, but people are kind of still holding back just enough from overcommitting into it.
I think there's some truth in that. We're seeing a lot of things happening right now, but there's definitely, everyone's doing their full due diligence, really looking at things. I think even, stuff we're seeing coming on right now, they're looking a little closer than they would have a couple years ago. Margins are tighter, that labor cost, what's it going to come in at, where can we be? Everyone's definitely a little more cautious than maybe they've been in the past. And I think, some of that's driven by the lending side as well. And just, but everyone's real interested in what things cost. And, you look back, I'll say, 2008, 2009, leading into that, there was a lot of stuff coming in the door that, even me as a landscape architect went, how'd they get money to do that? I think people are smarter than they were.
Or they've learned their lesson and
Most. There's always some out there who are going to do some things that make you go, huh, okay.
Well, the longer the cycle runs, the more likely that somebody would get into the business that maybe wouldn't have had that experience in the past too. So it makes me wonder, are you seeing any new players come into the market that are maybe changing things?
We're actually starting to see more out-of-state investors coming into the market, looking to invest. They think Iowa's an unbelievable place to invest compared to what kind of costs they may have in San Francisco or New York to buy a property, to renovate it. And here, they consider it bargain basement prices.
So let's talk a little bit about land development. One of the things I've noticed in a lot of plans is a lot of attention being paid to stormwater detention, and maybe that wasn't paid as much attention to 10 or 15 years ago. What's changed, and what is that going to look like?
Okay, I'll take first crack. I think the biggest change is about stormwater quality. The quantity requirements have always been in place, but it was really how efficiently can we hold this water and then get it gone. Now it's, what is that water quality? How do we impact that? Whether it's through, green measures or other things. I think the other thing we're seeing more of is really not thinking on a site-by-site basis, but trying to think a little bit more regionally or larger development. I'll use Milwaukee, Kettlestone as an example. 90% of the properties within that 1,500 acres fall into regional detention. So it doesn't have to be dealt with on site, which makes development easier and those things. So we're starting to see some of that, but I think the focus is going to be more about quality than the quantity has always been there. But
One of the issues that probably one of our bigger issues for us in redevelopment of the University Avenue corridor is most of that property was developed in the 70s. There were minimal stormwater requirements, and now you have properties wanting to redevelop, and we're requiring them to come into today's standards in terms of the stormwater requirement. And we are looking at more of a regional approach to stormwater management between us and the city of Clive. There's a lot of issues that we need to fix, and I think we've got a pretty good plan to go forward with doing that. So it's kind of a new way of thinking about things, I think, particularly for my community.
And to build on that, we work almost exclusively in the redevelopment space, and it is challenging because several of our properties are located in areas that were developed in the 60s and 70s where the stormwater requirements weren't at the level they are today. And you go in and you deal with a 4-5 acre parcel surrounded by other parcels that don't have the same requirements. The water still runs the same. It runs right over you down the hill. And yet you still have to figure out a way to accommodate that. And because of the other things we've talked about, it's all expensive and it all adds to the cost of the project. And I don't think as developers we don't want to address it, but when you're dealing with redevelopment and you don't know when those properties adjacent to you are going to be redeveloped, it becomes hard to develop that approach that will assist everybody in the area.
So what does some of that stormwater retention look like? Does it, and does that mean less paving? Walk us through what it looks like going forward compared to maybe what it used to look like.
I would like to say it's less paving. In reality, it's not. For projects to work, you have to have a certain number of parking stalls. You have to, nobody's out there wanting to pave more and spend more than they have to. So really what you're seeing is kind of right sizing. We are seeing more shared parking uses, shared uses where we can try and reduce some of those parking counts, which then has an impact on stormwater. We're seeing a lot more in the metro, just underground storage. It's not all in ponds anymore. While it's an expense, it's becoming, well, it was becoming more cost effective. We now have the labor shortage, and there aren't people, and it doesn't necessarily help timelines to dig a big hole that you have to fill back in. So, but as far as the solutions, it's trying to be creative. We're doing a project right now for Johnston for their town center, where we're doing some demonstration islands of some things that can happen in islands that change the perspective of it doesn't just have to be a grass mound. We can take those areas and start to use them. Every little bit adds up when it comes to stormwater, so we're always looking at where can we get that.
Have you seen unique examples of that nationwide or worldwide?
I wouldn't use the word unique. There's some different things out there, just as far as where do you take that water in and what do you do with it, and that gets into some of that quality stuff. The old system was how fast can we get it to an intake, how fast can we get it into a pipe, and how fast can we get it to the river. Now you're seeing a lot of, it comes in through a bioswale or something that helps slow down that flow, filter that flow, gives you potentially a little bit of volume before it goes into the pipe, and so.
I think the operative word that Chris said was right sizing, and I think the approach that really helps is for the cities and for the developers to work together to think of parking solutions and storm management solutions that maybe can evolve. Nobody wants to put the storm management underground and pave over it and then find out no one ever uses those 55 parking spots anyway. So I see the opportunity to start with above ground detention, and then if that doesn't work, have an understanding that then that will go underground and more parking will be added. The problem is strict parking restrictions. The formulas don't necessarily work, and you can't apply one situation to another. So if the developer and the city work together and agree over time, then we have more flexibility. And believe me, the last thing a developer wants is that their development is underparked, because that is so hard to market if you don't have enough parking. However, again, you don't want to have 55 vacant parking spots that sit there every day, and you're sitting there looking at the underground storage going, that cost me a lot of money.
Well, and that's got to be kind of tough when we're trying to create more walkable neighborhoods and areas. We have vehicles that are becoming autonomous. So how, looking at, you obviously can't look into your crystal ball and say, in 5 years, we're not going to have as many cars. So how do you balance all of that?
Flexibility. Yeah, just taking that phased approach and being open to things are going to change. And we have to anticipate what we can, but we're not going to anticipate everything. And when things come up, figure out what to do. We hear a lot about autonomous vehicles. I'm a little skeptical personally. Even if there's an autonomous vehicle, there's still those daily trips that people are going to want to take. Those vehicles are still out there, and if they're not parking, then where are they going? So that's not going to solve everything in the next 5-10 years.
We had Liz Holland on one of these discussions, and she was talking about the parking around the mall. And so I'm curious, when you start looking at that, they're talking about trying to redevelop these vast expanses of parking. I wonder what type of effects might that have on development, maybe the price of that land in some ways that allows people to maybe think of different uses around things that already exist.
Well, that must have been a tough one. No one wants to answer that. I think from a redevelopment standpoint, there are opportunities that are going to be created with the changes in how people use those spaces. And I think particularly when you start talking about a regional mall setting, there's only going to be so many regional malls in the metro. It can only support so much. And as those things cycle like anything else, we're a society of what's the latest and greatest. So what opportunities do those provide? I guess, Jackie, I'd be interested from a redevelopment standpoint, what you guys see.
Well, and I think one of the challenges of Merle Hay Mall and then a couple of the properties that my boss owns is that you have an existing building that still has some economic value, and so you're not going to redevelop the 25 acres. So you're having to integrate new development with existing development, which means your parking, your relationship with the buildings is not going to be ideal, and it's challenging. And I'll give you an example. In our portfolio is Harding Hills. Joe owns the strip mall. Hy-Vee owns the Hy-Vee that was flooded a couple years ago that they put a significant reinvestment in. It's old, it's tired, it has a sea of parking. You don't have to be in development to know there's an opportunity there. However, that building sits at an angle to the streets, and then when you start thinking about what kind of uses you would put there, the way the building sits is really challenging. And that's not unique by any means. And to me, you look at the parking and you see the opportunities, but then how you get the traffic circulation to work, how the buildings talk to each other, how people see the space, they need to be comfortable utilizing it. And that's one of the biggest challenges.
Let's continue
And that's when you hire us.
Yeah, exactly. And then you go, oh.
Let's continue going down that redevelopment road. We've got several areas in the metro that are going to be redeveloped. The University Avenue corridor in West Des Moines. We've got 8th Street in West Des Moines. We've got the Market District downtown. How do you go about, let's start with a broader question. How do you go about doing that redevelopment? What sort of things are you looking for? And then we'll see where that takes us.
Well, I think, at least from West Des Moines' perspective, we realize that the parking standards we have now are parking standards for 1970s, not 2020. So I think we're going to probably be more flexible in taking a look at how much parking is actually on a site. And we certainly don't want to have areas parked like, okay, the day after Thanksgiving, because, you know, you'll have that 55 parking spaces that never get used. And so I think, you know, there's going to be a lot more thought given to, okay, how much parking do we really need without causing congestion? But a little bit congestion's not terribly bad either, you know? So, and I think that, you know, Chris may be right in terms of the autonomous vehicles and stuff, but it's something we also have to consider. We had a recent project that is looking at doing a new building on an existing site. They were going to do a parking ramp, but they structured and built, they're going to build a parking ramp such that all the decks are on level rather than sloped, because their feeling is at some point in time there's not going to be the vehicles coming to the site, and they can convert that parking ramp to a future office building. They were more concerned about having a large enough drop-off area for people that were coming there for services and stuff.
So as we're redeveloping areas, are we going to see streets turned into pedestrian areas? What are we going to be seeing that we may not have now?
Hopefully, we learned our error of our ways when we started making everything ped malls and downtowns. I come from a community in Illinois that they probably made every bad planning decision you could, and the biggest one they made was turning the main street in town into a ped mall. Now, that's not to say that the streets won't get a little narrower and a little friendlier, and it shouldn't have to be a 100-yard dash to try to get across the street and on the walk light.
Yeah, and I think what, and you're already starting to see it in the metro, but is getting streets right-sized. You know, we don't need 6 lanes of traffic everywhere. Getting things narrowed down, giving the pedestrians more space, but I don't see it ever where the street component's going away.
Yeah, and you see that in the city of Des Moines. They've been looking at the Douglas Avenue corridor, and as it transitions into Euclid, and anytime the larger the area you're looking to redevelop, the more challenging it is. But a huge challenge there is that Douglas and Euclid are a state highway, and people just drive down that at a high rate of speed. So it's how do you right-size it, and how do you slow down the traffic so that businesses can be successful? Because if you're going down the street at 45 miles an hour, you don't see what that storefront is. And if you do see what it is, and then you think you want to stop by tomorrow, they're going to have a place to park. So it's figuring out the right balance so you can still move the traffic, and then sell the citizens on the fact that it may take them a whole 5 minutes longer, but look at what your benefits are. But the longer you do that, University Corridor is a good example, you just have more challenges.
No, and I think Clyde put it well, that a little bit of congestion is the level you want to get to. Everyone thinks they have to get everywhere right away, and every level of service should be level of service A. And that's the only thing that's acceptable, and that shouldn't be the goal for redevelopment. All this ties, from a redevelopment standpoint, I think it all ties back to the infrastructure. So that's roads, that's stormwater that we talked about, that's sanitary sewer, all of those things are what's, you know, you mentioned Market District. That's what held up development in the Market District till now, is they couldn't service it from an infrastructure standpoint. So once they get those things figured out, things will start to happen.
I certainly agree with Chris's comments, because coming from California, which tried to build their way out of traffic congestion, you know, they found out they couldn't do it. I mean, every time they added more lanes to the freeway, they just had more congestion there. So, you know, you start having to look at alternatives to continue to add more lanes.
Are there some things that you see folks doing that you say, you know, I really wish they wouldn't be doing those things in the future because they're going to cause potential challenges in the future, maybe?
So you want me to throw my clients under the bus?
Yes, absolutely.
No.
Or maybe some tendencies that people still have, or beliefs that they still have, that maybe you see yourself trying to shift their perception when you're working through the process?
Well, I think there's still a tendency to potentially overpark. There's a tendency from an infrastructure standpoint, particularly with cities, that we're starting to see a shift, but I'll use stormwater. For a long time, it was, the belt and suspenders model. Yeah, we'll try your new idea, but you're still going to put in an intake and lots of pipe, which then didn't make it economically viable to try something new. We're seeing all the communities in the metro definitely taking a more open mind to what are some things, what's some of this flexibility. Is there room for more? There always is room for more. But it's, being able to work together. And I think the other piece of that is seeing property owners who won't work together, is, from my perspective, one of the big stumbling blocks that we run into. And particularly when you start looking at some of these corridor developments where you've got lots of different owners and who could benefit from some shared parking agreements or cross-access agreements or all those things, but they don't like that person or have their, no, this is my box and I'm going to stay in it. So we've got to push some of those things, I think. But.
Yeah, I think one other thing that we really need to push the development community in doing, and probably even more so some of the consultants, and we experienced this when we were doing all the development around Jordan Creek. We were wanting to try to be very flexible in how somebody developed a piece of property. And we finally had to get a lot of pretty pictures out to say, hey, you could do something like this on your property. And they go, oh yeah, I know where that is. That's in Scottsdale or that's in Florida. And we said, yeah, you can do that. I can? Yeah, And sometimes it was their consultants that were holding them back. No, you guys, not one of them. But the consultants were so used to, if I do it this way, I know I can get it through the approval process with the city in the least amount of effort and the least amount of time. And, we were really trying to encourage people, think outside the box.
So thinking outside the box, you're looking at doing a redevelopment plan for the University Avenue corridor. For Chris, why don't you can you talk a little bit about what goes into putting together a plan that massive?
Lots of discussions and listening. That is, and I started to touch on it before, you've got a lot of different property owners with a lot of different thoughts as to what they think their property can be, should be, could be. Our goal is to step back and say, what's the highest and best use along this corridor? How do we improve it? What are those opportunities? But really, it starts by talking to all those people and listening and seeing what those things are and where we can find some common ground. What are the deficiencies from an infrastructure standpoint? Clyde talked about the stormwater issue. A lot of those properties were developed at a time that was different, and how does that get solved? And that's only going to get solved by everybody working together, both West Des Moines and Clive and all the property owners.
Well, and to build on to what Clyde was saying and what Chris is saying is that all of those uncertainties put risk on the developer. So that's why it's easy to go to a cornfield and build a strip mall it's been done 10 times, because you know that the process is certain and you know it doesn't take as much time, and time is money. And 8th Street's a good example. We changed our mind, but working through the process, it's a give and take, and there's uncertainty there, and you don't know where that end line is going to be, and most developers don't like that uncertainty. So, and in times that are good and you don't have to search out projects and it's easy to throw strip malls up on a cornfield, then it's more difficult to do those infills, and it's more challenging to get those landowners to explore the alternatives. And it's hard to say, hey, I'd like to do this, and the first thing that might be said to a committee might say, because it's just not city staff, it's the boards and commissions, well, we don't do it like that. And honestly, it's a lot of times it's not the staff, because the staff is forward-thinking. They see where the direction needs to go. And so it's working through that process. We do projects with a lot of hair on them, but in a lot of ways, it'd be way easier to do other projects in the group. That arena's full, and so we choose to do the infill projects, but they're challenging because of the stormwater, because of the other infrastructure, because you don't know what's going to be buried underneath the site. You're going to have to demo, and that demo is a huge cost. So you add all those factors together, it becomes more challenging.
I'm going to use that term from now on. A lot of hair on them. No, and I think that's true, and that's a lot of it, and a lot of what we do is help educate those boards and commissions and councils. Because I think you're right, most staffs within the metro are thinking forward. It's just, change is hard. People don't like change. This is the way we've done it. And I think, from a greenfield development, yeah, it's easier. But it's also not as much fun sometimes. So.
Yeah. And I think particularly from a redevelopment standpoint, and we're seeing it in other parts of the metro area, and we're really starting to see it in West Des Moines, is that there was probably over-commercialization in some areas that were not really able to support all that commercial development, which means that property owner who thinks he's got a certain amount of investment there because it's a commercial property, okay, maybe the best use for that property is not commercial. Maybe it's a residential or a mixed-use type of thing. And that's going to take some adjustment of attitudes and thoughts to realize that, we're looking at the highest and best potential of a property.
So where does the city come in on that in helping that landowner? I mean, is there different incentives cities are going to have to start looking at, or new types of incentives to get landowners to think maybe they need to use their properties differently so it can be redeveloped?
I think certainly incentives would be one thing we'd take a look at, carrot and stick approach. In order for that property to be redeveloped, maybe it needs to go to a residential designation. Maybe we'll give you more density to be able to accomplish, get the values you think the property is really worth. And also, I think it's an educational process, to be able to show them that, yeah, they can continue to do what they've been doing, but that commercial center is going to continue to diminish in value to the point where it's not really worth a lot.
I was just going to ask, we've talked a lot about some of the projects that are underway or some areas that have been redeveloped. Are there some areas that that if you start looking a little bit further out in the future, there's a lot happening right now. So I'm just curious, are there some other areas that people are looking at and going, well, maybe that's a place that might be ripe for people to take a look at redeveloping?
I think our corridors, our major transit and transportation corridors, Merle Hay, Douglas I've already mentioned, Ingersoll's already seeing a lot of redevelopment. Southeast 14th is, but all of those corridors are prime opportunity to become more dense. And I think exactly what Clyde said, they're probably over-retailed or over-commercialized, and so we can step back and put more density in residential. But that takes some assistance, like I said, high demo costs, you have infrastructure improvements that are going to have to happen. And so there needs to be some kind of incentive package or some way to bridge that gap that's going to happen on those projects to get them done.
Years ago, you wanted to make sure you had phone lines and this thing and that thing. What aren't we doing in these new developments today, and what's needed in these new developments that you didn't need 10 years ago?
I think, at least from what I've heard from people that are the users of those services, it's fiber. I mean, you take a look at the typical user within my community, really in the metro area. They're typically an office user. They don't need a lot of water. They don't need a lot of sanitary sewer, but they live and die by the amount of broadband that they potentially have available to them. And as our economy becomes more and more interconnected and global, speed of communication is going to be critical for everybody. I mean, one of the reasons I think the Des Moines area has been so successful is the amount of long-haul fiber we have coming through the metro area. So I think that's helped us out a lot.
So is West Des Moines doing anything different than maybe it did 10 years ago when it comes to fiber?
We don't want to give away all of our secrets, but no, there's some things that we're working with the telecommunication companies on. One of the biggest problems that we have, and I think a lot of other communities have, is you take a look at that public right-of-way, and you've got 30, 40 different fiber lines in there. And it gets to the point where on some of the major roadways, there's no room. And companies are having to cross at the middle of the block rather than the corner because, again, there's no room there. So we're looking at ways to be more efficient in the use of the right-of-ways that we have and getting companies, oh my gosh, to actually work together in terms of doing fiber banks and different things like that.
One of the things in redevelopment that's really important, because like we said a lot of times you're talking about pockets in an area that's already developed, is trying to expand that connectivity. 8th Street is a good example. It's an area that had a lot of activity, declined over a few years. We're building about 80 residential units. We'll bring activity back, but how do you link those people to other areas in the community? We're consciously not putting big fitness area in because we want them to go to the Y. However, try to walk between the south side of 8th Street and the north side by Walmart, and it's challenging on any day. So then how do you work with the cities to build that connectivity in? Anybody that lives in those units could, if they could get to the trail, could ride their bike to downtown to work. But you have to build that connection. And that's what we look at when we're looking at our projects is, okay, amenities within the units or within the development cost a lot of money, so how can you build those connectivity to make them part of the community?
Yeah, I would echo that it's the connectivity across all levels that's really important in identifying helping potential end users, developers, cities understand what it can be, what they can reach from there. People tend to take a very myopic view of this is where I live, this is what's right here. So it's helping educate them as to what that means.
You talked about out-of-state investors earlier, and I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about maybe what effects we might see that having on the market here.
I guess a big concern of mine would be that out-of-state investors need to be involved investors. We don't want to see somebody come in, buy a piece of property, and forget it. And we've seen that happen at times. And I think we've been blessed with having a lot of really fantastic local ownership that takes a great deal of pride in their properties. And that's always a concern that you get somebody either at a corporate or something like that, that's Des Moines, isn't it? Or someplace out there, they have to grow potatoes there or something.
So when you see those out-of-state investors come in, what are they looking for here?
I think you're seeing them looking different. You see, like Clyde says, some of them are building existing portfolios, whether it's residential buildings or office centers. But we're noticing there's also out-of-state investors interested in new projects, small projects. We do small projects, and there are many out-of-state investors and financial advisors that are assembling pools to invest in small real estate projects in Iowa. And those people are going to be not as active as if they bought a property and are running it, but they're bringing critical equity to projects that bring them to the finish line.
And I think that's because they see a lot of stability and continued growth happening here, so.
And Iowans are everywhere.
And Iowans are everywhere.
So do you guys have questions to ask each other? Have you?
No.
I will. Jackie or Clyde, what, if there was one project that you would want to take on in the metro, what would that be? Well, I wasn't going to go with a little question, so.
I think I'm already doing that with University Avenue corridor, as you guys well know.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, truthfully, for us, I think that although the area is still very successful, we realize that we need to do something there before it gets so far down that it's just going to take massive infusion of money to bring it back. And so what we're doing now, I think, is going to affect, West Des Moines and Clive for many, many years in the future. And I think it potentially could set a pattern for redevelopment of other areas in the metro. So we're looking for you to be really innovative.
we'll do that for you, Clyde.
So what sort of effect is land prices having on developments? Because we're seeing land prices go up and up.
Well, particularly in the redevelopment world, it has a huge impact. And I think Clyde said it earlier, a property owner believes their property is worth X. It's been in decline, but they still think it's worth X. And so when they sell it, they expect that what they have the sale price list is what it is, and it's not reasonable, particularly if you add in even if it's vacant, just the cost of redevelopment on a site in West Des Moines, or it's tremendous, and it's somehow resetting that expectation that what they thought they had is not. It's not there. And this happens, there's people that have had vacant property for decades and thought that would always become a strip mall. Well, that horse is way galloped a long ways away, and now they're still thinking that it'll be sold for a strip mall and they'll get great economic benefit. And look down the street and you see how many storefronts and adjacent strip malls vacant. That's not the opportunity. But they still won't move on their land price. And to me, is a major stumbling block on these corridors.
And that's, that's probably one of the biggest things we face when we come in to do a plan, particularly on a corridor, is everyone thinks their property is the absolute most valuable property in the corridor. And that's when Clyde talked about, well, maybe it's not retail, maybe it's housing. What is that highest and best use? What actually makes sense? And that goes from corridor development to when we're doing, greenfield comprehensive plans. Everybody thinks their property is the best retail property.
And you start talking about housing. You just had your panel the other day, and the housing that needs to be added in the metro is workforce and housing that has attainable rents, and it's not luxury apartments that line these corridors. These corridors can really contribute to the well-being of the neighborhoods around. You want a dense use next to these busy corridors. They're great buffers, they're great sound barriers, they can protect the neighborhoods. But at the same time, it's unreasonable to think that you're going to have high-end apartments lining all these corridors everywhere. We need workforce housing, and those, guess what, the construction cost between workforce housing and luxury housing isn't great, and so you have a gap, and we have to solve that gap problem.
So where does that gap come from? Because on one hand, I know we've done this in the past. We've said one thing we don't have is a shortage of land. We have a lot of developable land actually in Des Moines. So do you think it's out of balance then on where the prices actually really are being asked for at?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things that I've seen is particularly the price of greenfield sites have just gone way out of proportion to what their economic value is at this point in time. And, we've been totally amazed where somebody is looking for, $3.50 a square foot for, a cornfield, and there's nothing around it. And we're going, really? And they're kind of the attitude of, well, I'll stick with that price. Somebody will eventually pay it. I'm in it for the long haul, which I think I've seen some developers that would have maybe done a greenfield project in the past now are looking at doing redevelopment because it's not totally easy, but it's a little bit easier to figure out, okay, I'm going to be in this neighborhood and my property's worth the range here.
Well, I would imagine that because it would be an easier to develop property, some of the uncertainty that we talked about with the timeline for a project and whether you're going to discover underneath the property that there's a big challenge, right? That would be why they're holding out, going, well, maybe eventually that's the easier route.
No, definitely it could be the easier route. I think we do have a lot of long-term property owners that, and that goes from the greenfields to some of the developments, as Jackie talked about, that, it's not costing me a whole lot to hold on to it, so we'll let it sit there until someone does come pay my price. And, we see a lot of, eventually someone comes along, but.
Well, it's frustrating when that contributes to the gap, and it makes it difficult for a city to come up with incentive programs, and really what they're funding is that high land price versus the construction, the cost of construction or something like that. It costs about as much to construct an apartment building here as it does in Kansas City or Minneapolis, and however, the land should not rival, but sometimes it does, and it's very difficult for a city to rationalize subsidizing for overpriced property.
We had done some pretty significant studies on housing, and we brought several developers in to talk to us about housing, particularly workforce-type housing. And I had more than one developer actually tell me that they thought it was much easier to build a $700,000, $800,000 house and let it sit on the market for 6 months than to build, say, $200,000, $350,000 houses that were maybe a little more attainable in price. And they said, I can make more money off that one house with less hassle. And, we were kind of like, wow, okay.
Clyde, what are you guys seeing? Are you seeing any unusual asks on the incentive side? Are there any new, I know that's a loaded question. Are there any new things out there that you see cities are going to be trying to do, or I guess, Jackie, are there things that you guys want that Clyde's not giving you?
We typically see, okay, we want property tax rebates or abatement. We don't do abatements, but we do rebates. Most of the major developers, when the project's coming in, they think it's almost by right that you're going to give me 5 years or 10 years of 100% abatement or rebates, and you're going to put all my infrastructure in, or elsewise I'll go next door. They'll do it for me. And so that puts a community in a really tough spot if you're trying to retain those jobs in your community, retain a really good employer that's been a very big part of your community. Like you say, bye, or, well, okay, we'll work with you on this.
I do think more from a state perspective than a local perspective, your brownfield, grayfield tax credit program could be much more effective if it didn't have the low annual cap on it. There are many sites on those corridors that would qualify for grayfield or brownfield, but the pot gets used up too quickly, and there's really no other resource to replace it. The city only has so much capacity, and so you have a lot of corners that could be redeveloped if there was just that little extra push and they could access those extra funds, the corners where the old gas stations were, or auto repair place. It just has that little, you know, that the tanks didn't leak, but
they
you
were
still,
there.
there's still work
Yeah.
to do. And because those programs are limited in scope, you assume you won't get those funds.
So we're getting close to our end time here. Let's talk a little bit about sustainability. Sort of, this is the last question. What sort of features are you seeing in new or redeveloped areas what new sustainability features, or what are we going to be seeing more of? I know in the Market District, they talked about solar fields and geothermal and those kinds of things. Are we going to be seeing more of those types, both in redevelopments and in new areas?
We're all looking at you, Jack. Well, I think one of the things we're seeing, just the discussions shifted a little bit from sustainability. It's not just about green, but it's about what is the long-term viability of the project, what's the life cycle. It's not just how green do we make it, but it's can this project sustain itself over the long term? And I think that is starting to shift from a project-by-project basis to, as we start to talk about a lot of these corridors, are they able to be economically viable? That's part of sustainability. It's not just the green features that are sustainability anymore.
Yeah, I think the perspective of looking at an infill site and recognizing the sustainability of that site versus the actual features of the building, it's, if you can build 80 units on a corridor where there's better transit or better access to trails, more walkability, that's more sustainable than maybe a project on a green field where people have to drive everywhere, even if that project has geothermal and or solar panels and or water conservation practices, just because of the demands on the infrastructure to build that project out there and the ongoing infrastructure demands of the people who live there. That said, we've been talking about cost of construction, and unfortunately, a lot of sustainability things still take extra funds, and when you're struggling just to get a project to go, it's hard often to layer those extra things. And from a residential side, you don't have those demands. People are still going to be willing to pay X for where they live. I think office, depends who the user is, if they're willing to pay that extra premium for that space.
I think also one of the things that I know our city and quite a few other cities in the metro are really interested in is not just the next subdivision, but actually creating communities and creating communities, whether it's an apartment complex within a larger context or it's several subdivisions that, the connectivity, different things like that. And Jackie touched on it earlier about, hey, if we could get our residents better access to the bike trail or to get up to Walmart, so if they want to walk, they can. Because right now, you're probably taking your life in your own hands. But just to give people the opportunity or the options to be able to do some of these things.
Just real quickly on, you mentioned housing developments, and in our housing discussion, we talked about some of the developments out in the suburb areas, and I can't remember if it was Waukee that didn't have a ton of housing development last year. Kathy, do you help me out here just to make sure I'm...
No, I don't think
You don't think so? Are you still seeing housing developments coming online? And if you're looking out into the future, are you seeing some new things happening to take up some of that land?
Actually are seeing quite a bit of interest in terms of new development. A lot of cases, it's a matter of, is the infrastructure there to be able to accommodate what they want to do? Because in most of our cases, it's on the edge. And so, is the infrastructure there to be able to get people to and from where they want to be? And it's also kind of a chicken and egg thing. Like, okay, I don't want to plunk a subdivision out here and gee, where do I go to the dry cleaners? Where do I drop my kids off at daycare? You know, where's the nearest school? You know, so that's more our line of, you know, we want to look at developing communities rather than just plunking subdivisions out there with no interaction between them.
We're just about out of time, so why don't we go ahead and each of you get an opportunity to give a final closing thought. It could be something maybe we didn't talk about, but feel free to give a final thought. So why don't we start down with Clyde, that way you get the final talk this time.
Well, I think that overall, I'm pretty optimistic in terms of where I see the economy for the rest of this year and even into a good part of next year. I think a lot will depend on, you know, which way the national elections go and how people feel about that. From what we've seen and the projects, though, that we've got going on, I think there's still a lot of interest in developing, and there's still the need here. It's not one of those situations like, okay, we're going to go build another strip center that we really don't need because there's not the retailers to fill it. There is still that need for housing and for retail development. It may be not always where, you know, it needs to be, but I think we're getting better at figuring that out.
I'll just build on what Clyde said because I agree. I'm optimistic about the near future for development. Actually, I've been through cycles in Des Moines, and I'm optimistic about Des Moines. It's a stable metropolitan area. Our lows aren't terribly low. Our highs aren't terribly high. We're stable. We continue to grow. And I think there's exciting opportunities and a lot of forward motion on both improving our suburban communities as well as Des Moines, which strengthens us all. And I don't think there's a shortage for projects for any developers or cities to keep progressing forward.
So I hate to be the negative person here, but if you were going to look at something that would cause you concern, or some things that if you started to see them happening, it would give you pause, what would some of those things be?
I think that as a metro, sometimes we forget that we're very linked to our agricultural community in the state, and I do feel that any prolonged downturn in agriculture will impact us, whether it's the optimism of our major corporations. We also, of course, have major agricultural producers that are based in the area, that have employees in the area. And so if there continues to be challenges to our agricultural economy, I think that could really impact the Des Moines metro.
Anybody else have a thought on that?
Yeah, I guess concern for me would be if you start seeing employers saying, this market doesn't work for me because I can't find the workforce. And then they start saying, I'm going to open up a satellite facility in Denver or Phoenix and things like that. From what I've heard from my associates out there, everybody's got the issue of not being able to find the right skilled workers. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to work together to make sure that we're able to continue to develop that workforce that our companies are needing.
Chris, any thoughts on that in terms of something to be, if you were going to be concerned of something?
No, I mean, I would echo Jackie's. I think we do tend to forget in the metro that we are an agricultural state, and we're tied to that. And as that goes, that, you know, Iowa, as Jackie said, Iowans are everywhere. We're all Iowans. We all know somebody in the ag industry. So when they start to feel the pinch, it gives everybody else a little bit more uncertainty. So that would be one of the ones that I would focus on. You know, I would echo what both Jackie and Clyde said. I'm optimistic. There's a lot of good things going on, and it's around the entire metro. You know, when I was kind of looking through our backlog of work, thinking about coming here today, we have projects in every corner of the metro. There's not it's all westward or north or south. You know, it is all over the metro. Everything is going strong. So.
Great. Well, that's going to do it for us today. We're out of time. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. Our best story ideas always come from folks that are watching and reading our materials and the stuff that Kathy's reporting on. If something today spurred a thought for you or a story idea, or you want to reach out to us to potentially talk about it, Kathy's contact information is going to show up on the screen. She'd love to talk to you and learn more about what you are interested in learning about. This is just one of 5 roundtable discussions that we're hosting as part of our annual real estate magazine that came out on April 24th. Make sure to check those out online at businessrecord.com/AREM. I want to give a big thank you to each of our panelists. You each did a great job today. And finally, again, my name is Chris Conetzkey, and I'm the publisher for the Business Record. If you have any questions, feedback, or need to reach out my way, my contact information will be on the screen. Thanks for joining.